What's up, Edugamers? Today we're talking with Dan White from Filament Games. We're chatting about video games and game-based learning. We're going to look at what that looks like as a remote experience, what it looked like before the pandemic and that transition to the pandemic, and what that might look like in the future. I'm super excited for our chat today, so let's get into the episode. If you are new to our YouTube channel or new to the podcast, or if you've been around a while, this might be just a reminder for you, but we are Board Game with Education. We focus on providing game-based learning and gamification resources, tips, tricks. We do it all. And one of the things we do on our website, we carry different hobby and mass market board games. So if you're interested in implementing a tabletop game as part of your learning environment, whether that be at home or in the classroom, be sure to check out boardgamingwitheducation.com. We're working on a lot of new things coming up, including a board game crate, and that comes packed with different games to get you set up with your learning environment. If you have questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me, podcast@boardgamingwitheducation.com. All right, let's get to the talk. So welcome to another episode of Board Game with Education. I am your host, Dustin. I'm here joined by Dan. Super excited to have you here, Dan White from Filament Games. And Filament Games is all about creating experiences and learning or playful experiences that improve people's lives. So there are a lot of games that Filament Games have produced. I'm excited to learn more about some of your games and kind of what you've done with game-based learning. And that's what we're going to talk about today is using video games for learning. Before we kind of jump into the topic, would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and what you do and maybe an introduction to Filament Games?
Absolutely. Yeah, so Filament Games, every day we get up, we put our pants on, and we develop games for positive impact, as you mentioned. A lot of people make games, well, everybody who makes games is trying to have some kind of impact on the player, right? But usually it's in situ, it's in the moments while they're playing the game, and usually the desired impact is entertainment. So one of the main things that sets us apart is we also care about what happens to the player after the game. A lot of people think of this in terms of the colloquialism is kind of transfer, like how does that experience transfer out into the real world. So for us it's like, how did that behavior change that player or that player's cognition in some way? Did we create a new behavior? Did we create a new perspective, a new skill set, a new mindset, etc.? And ideally it's a positive impact as well.
Right. So I wonder, before we kind of go further, I want to ask, when you come across someone, because this is something that you kind of learn pretty early on when you start looking at game-based learning and games as an art form, right? Games are art, and not a lot of people maybe consider games as art. How do you approach or open up that conversation to someone who's never thought about that before?
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. I was just watching a video about the unintended consequences of designing rewards into games.
Mm,
And I think one of the really interesting artistic aspects of games, well, all art is intended to have some kind of impact on people, right? But games almost take it to this next level of some people might even consider it like cognitive manipulation, right? Like I want the player to do X, and so I'm going to give them incentive Y or encouragement Z. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting about games as art is that as a game developer or a game designer, it's a dialogue as opposed to a one-way street, right? I'm not filming a movie and then having you sit and consume it passively, or making a drawing a picture or a painting and having you passively consume it. I'm giving you a space in which you can actually bring your own thoughts and ideas and perspectives, and then implement those thoughts and ideas and perspectives in the form of actions in the context of the verbs or mechanics that I've created for you in the game. And then you get a response. And that response is something that I, as a designer, maybe thought of, or maybe it's emergent. Like, so for example,
mhm.
right now we're working on a robotics game where it's a very physics-based space. And so the player's inputs, a number of things are predictable, and there's a certain number of variables that are simply not predictable. And so that's the thing that I think is actually one of the things that makes games art in a very different way than traditional forms of art, traditional medium, is that it's actually a type of co-creation, which is, to me, just absolutely awesome.
Yeah, that's super cool. I like how you put it as a dialogue between, right, the player and the creator of the game, or the just the game and the player. And it reminds me of one of the first times I kind of experienced that perspective was with Ralph Koster. He talks about
Mm,
games can do something no other art form can do. And you mentioned that response, that feedback you get from playing a game.
absolutely.
Awesome. So we want to get into the topic of using video games for learning. And I know this was a pretty big deal this past year because a lot of people were online, and how we use video games remotely or in the classroom. How would you approach this topic maybe to someone first kind of getting into this idea of using video games as a part of their learning environment or in their classroom?
I like to think of games as experience engines, and I think that's part of the reason why they're so potent as a pedagogy. And for people who are sort of steeped in the vernacular of the learning sciences, I think of game-based learning. And yeah, game-based learning is in many ways being like a cousin to project-based learning or inquiry-based learning. So the idea is we're creating a problem space for the player to explore, to make decisions in, ideally interesting decisions, and then in the process of playing with that space and trying to solve those problems, they are exposed to the learning objectives that we want them to learn. And this is really powerful stuff, right? Because every there's all different ways that people learn, but one of, at least in my experience, in grad schools, it was quite a while ago now for me, but at least for what I remember from my learning sciences degree as well, is that a lot of people learn through experience, and the more hands-on those experiences are, the better. And so games, yeah, again, are essentially experience engines. They give you an opportunity to experience something that otherwise might be very difficult or even impossible. So, for example, if I want to step into the shoes of an astronaut, as a 12-year-old, that's probably not feasible or practical, right? But in a game space, it absolutely is. And the other cool thing is, in the game space, we can play with the fidelity so that we can set it at just the right point to highlight
Mm,
the lessons that we think are most important in that space for that learner at that time. So for a 12-year-old, there's thinking about physics and uh, uh, you know things around being an astronaut. Obviously, I don't know a lot about what you need to know in order to be an astronaut.
sure.
I don't know, math and stuff like that, STEM, right?
Yeah.
Um, so here's maybe a more salient example is, if I want to teach you about a cell and how a cell works, in the beginning, I'm going to show you a picture of a cell that's not actually what a cell looks like, right? It's sort of
Mm,
an intentional lie, like a simplification of an abstract idea or concept that gives you handholds to grab onto in your learning trajectory. And then over time, those lies can gradually work their way toward becoming truths. But in the beginning, it's less about telling the player exactly how a system works. So this is one of the reasons that games are very different than simulations, right? Simulations are obsessed with this idea of fidelity. Like, we want to tell the learner exactly how this works. But in fact, simulations are always lies as well, right? Because there's no such thing as a perfect simulation. So it's all just a question of the
mm.
extent to which you're willing to suspend a certain amount of disbelief in order to focus on the parts of the learning objective that are actually important based on your personal learning trajectory.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the point you made, and I really like it, and it's very well said. And I think it works too, is to introduce teachers that are not familiar with game-based learning. It's called the cousin of project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, because really it is experiential learning. You're experiencing whatever it is, the learning outcome through the game, which is really great. So I guess can you share maybe some examples of Filament Games and what they've done to use video games this past year, particularly in a remote, I guess school. I mean, most schools were remote. So how or what games have you guys used?
Yeah, so I'll use two different examples to illustrate kind of what I see as different ends of the spectrum. And this spectrum is also on itself on a larger spectrum as well, which I'll try to articulate briefly. So the overall spectrum I see is from being sort of practice oriented experiences, drill and practice oriented experiences that tend to be focused on declarative knowledge. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have uh, more procedural oriented experiences that are about concepts and understandings. So, and that's where you oftentimes get into a lot of your soft skills education, like
Mhm.
uh, critical thinking or computational thinking, problem solving, design thinking, collaboration, creativity, etc. So we tend to focus on the right side of that spectrum to the extent possible at Filament. So we make a lot of different games for a lot of different types of organizations. Uh, so obviously the client has to say in that as well. But two different examples on more toward the right end of that spectrum. If you ratchet it all the way up, or all the way to the right, as it were, uh, you're looking at a game. So this game I mentioned, Roboco, which is a robot building sandbox space, where we're basically like, here's a problem. You got to build a robot that can deliver a sandwich to this table in a bistro, or cross this bridge and shut off a valve that's causing toxic goo to leak out, or whatever.
Mm.
How you solve that is entirely up to you. We're going to give you the parts. Here's some pistons, here's springs, here's servo motors, blocks, etc., gears, and then how you solve that problem is entirely up to you. Then as you move down the spectrum more toward the content knowledge end of the spectrum, you have games like iCivics. So we've made almost, I think, 20 games for an organization called iCivics, which uses a game-based curriculum to teach civics, basically civics literacy and knowledge. So these are things like, well, yeah, how does my government work? What does the executive
Mm.
branch do, et cetera, et cetera. And so even on that end of the spectrum, and this is why I say we inhabit the right side of this overall spectrum. So even on the low end of our spectrum, we're not going to put you in a space where, say, for example, we say, what's the Second Amendment? And then ask
Right.
you that question as in the form of a quiz, and then give you some sort of candy, coding around that,
Right. Right.
or whatever, after you get it right. So, and that stuff's fine, by the way. Like I don't have any like philosophical chip on my shoulder about that. It's just that um, I would classify those less as games and more as like digital interactives. And so in the case of a game like iCivics, what we're really trying to do is we're saying, what sort of identity or role can we put you in this space where you have a logical reason to engage with this content and learn
Mm.
this content. So basically, how can we make it so that this content has some sort of utility to you as a player? And then at the end of the day, our goal is to um, make sure that you not only understand it but will retain it in some kind of longitudinal way. And that's really where that experience-based learning comes back into play.
Yeah, and that's awesome. I kind of want to maybe pry you a little bit further on the. I guess I think of what is it, Kahoot or Quizzes.
Mm-hmm.
What's the third one? So yeah, I mean, you mentioned they're good tools. They're great tools, but looking at that versus, I think the name of the game, I Know Your Rights. Is that correct? Is
Oh,
that the
do I
name
have it
of it?
right?
Do
Mm-hmm.
I have a right? Right. So that's I've had a chance to play it a couple weeks ago. Someone introduced it to me before we had connected, which was kind of
Mm-hmm.
coincidence. But um, it's essentially a card game where you're practicing the Bill of Rights. Is that
Okay.
correct? Um,
Yeah, do I have it right? Oh, so
yeah.
actually, we incidentally we've made two different games about the Bill of Rights,
Okay. Okay.
and and one of them was called, and they're both, by the way, a very long time ago. So, testing my recollection here. One is
Okay.
definitely called "Do I Have a Right," and the other one is, oh gosh, what is the other one called? Uh, oh, well, now so you're gonna have to tell me more about the game. I'll tell you what game we played.
Yeah. So it was the one where you have to match the amendment
Yes.
with the
Okay,
right.
that's "Do I Have a Right?" Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I was, and that's kind of, I shared it with like another colleague. I was giving an example, like this is the epitome of game-based learning. You're learning the amendments through like practical examples in the world. I mean, some of these conversations come up on social media all the time now,
Yeah.
and they're in the amendment. So I wonder, can you kind of share a little bit more of what something like that experience, game-based learning experience like that game versus like using something like quizzes or Kahoot, and maybe some benefits to using the game-based learning experience.
Yeah, it's interesting to use that as an example in particular, because I would say that is probably as close as we I mean, that's actually an example of a game that does trend a little bit closer to the toward the Kahoot end of the spectrum. I mean, the thing is, if you want to sort of put on your if you want to sort of wax philosophical for a second, like every game, no matter how complex or deep it is always a set of questions. And those questions they're not necessarily explicit questions on the screen, but the game is asking you in one form or another, what do you want to do? Like what is the thing that you want to do next? And really, I think one of the things that separates interesting games, whether they're learning games or not, from less interesting games. I don't mean to sort of put a pejorative angle on it, but basically, is the answer to those questions interesting, and is it objectively right or wrong? And I think some of the most interesting learning experiences in general, whether they're games or not, are spaces where there's not like an objective right or wrong. Like in real life, right? Like it's
Mm.
not do I do A or B? It's like, well, there's benefits and drawbacks to A and B, and there's also infinite other possibilities as well. And so I think what we're trying to do, regardless of where we are on that spectrum, is trying to give the player the sense that they're inhabiting a space where they have as much agency as possible, and the possibility space is as big as possible. And do I have a right is actually a funny example, kind of going back what I was saying before, is that it's a space where we through a little bit of smoke and mirrors, we sort of use some tricks of the trade to give you the impression that it's a larger possibility space than it actually is. Um, and so I but then I guess I would still argue that that context still matters. Like it still matters that you're put in the role of somebody triaging law cases in a law firm, that there are actual people coming in who have actual problems that you're helping to triage through your understanding and expertise about, or your ability to apply your knowledge of the Constitution. And that's a and I think that sort of taps into this larger point that learners, whether they're young or old, just crave context. They crave a sense of like meaning, and why does
Mm.
this matter outside of the context of this specific intervention? And even if it feels like, even if it's as simple as, you know, we put you in the role of this particular character in this particular environment, if it feels logical to the player and it gives them a reason beyond just I need to try to figure out what the right answer is based on my knowledge of the Constitution and what this particular client needs, then that's a win.
Right, right. And I mean, see the game as like a very basic version of Hearthstone, if you've ever played that.
Yeah, sure.
Where it's, it's a card-based game, and yeah, maybe I didn't have enough time to explore to see that maybe it is more confined than what my experience was, but it seemed like there's some deeper strategy that could be involved in the game.
See,
Um
now you're making me question, because the other constitutional rights game that we made is almost exactly like Hearthstone.
okay, maybe that is the
Unfortunately,
one. I don't know. I thought yeah, I'll have to look
and the
because
titles are very similar. So
yeah, there's one because I played one, and then I think I probably went on to Google to like search it again, and then maybe it's the first one that came up, and I'm using that title as the game name of the game. So now I'm gonna have to look.
now we've
Awesome.
confused all your listeners.
Yeah, no, I'll leave it. I'll leave it in the description for anyone that's curious about the game. Because I enjoyed it, and I think it does definitely
Cool.
demonstrate some practical demonstrations of the experiences and arguments for the amendment, the different
Yes.
amendments.
The second game is called That's Your Right, by the way.
That you're right. Okay.
Now everybody understands why we're both confused
They're
between
very
the
similar.
fairly identical titles about the same subject matter, but different treatments.
Right. So, could you share a little bit more about Filament and their games versus in-person games and virtual environments, and kind of compare that through this past year and maybe going forward, what that would look like?
So, just want to make sure I'm clear. Are you asking about the use of games in the context of a pandemic where everybody's learning remotely versus the context of using digital games when everybody's physically co-located?
Right, right. And then maybe what that looks like now that we've lived through a pandemic, we've seen
Yeah,
some things work well that
yeah.
may carry over beyond the pandemic too.
Right. You know, this is a this is an interesting question, and here's why. During the pandemic, you your first instinct would be, okay, everybody's remote. Game-based learning is going to teachers are going to use games a lot more than they did
Mhm.
pre-pandemic. Um, and I think you can find examples where that is true. And I know for a number of clients that we work with where we get to see the statistics on usage, that was in fact the case. But across the board, I'm not sure that it averages out that way. And my theory is that the when I mean, the pandemic was hugely disruptive, right? So it changed
Right.
everything. It required everybody to scramble and figure out how to do distance learning, full-time distance learning for the first time. And game-based learning, even before the pandemic, game-based learning, like again, I would say like project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, it's this more sort of advanced pedagogy that requires I mean, it's not as I mean, frankly, it's not as easy to implement as some more standard or traditional pedagogies. And so even before the pandemic, I think a lot of educators were at least a lot of the educators I talked to about game-based learning, they're like, how do I do this? You know, what are the best practices and where's the good content? How do I find out how do I implement it? And 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 so when the pandemic came along was super disruptive and everybody was trying to figure out how to do remote learning, I almost feel like that sucked so much air out of the room that it was difficult, that it almost
Mm,
compounded that problem more than facilitated the increased use of game-based learning. So if you're now all of a sudden trying to just figure out how to do the things that used to be super straightforward, just like conduct a class,
right.
um, then it probably just have less bandwidth to think about now integrating these new technologies that you may or may not have integrated before the pandemic. So, um, I think I think I think using games during the like for I think for a lot of educators who were able to like make that transition relatively quickly and then get up and running and then say, okay, there are clearly some deficiencies to virtual learning compared to physical learning. How can I shore up some of those deficiencies by adding some virtual resources that are higher quality
Mm,
than the default digital resources that are available to us? And I think in those instances, game-based learning was used to very good effect. I'm just not really sure how widespread that was. And then post-pandemic, to answer the second part of your question, I what I hope will happen is that everybody, and even as we sort of go back to things the way they were, that everybody will say, okay, well, clearly, one of the things that this pandemic showed us is that our our everything digital, like digital learning for us, and when I say us, I guess I'm specifically saying K-12, but I guess it applies across the board. um, it's like digital's a plan B, maybe a plan C, that we haven't really, like, it's a plan, it's a contingency plan that we haven't put a lot of as much time and effort into as maybe we should. And now maybe it should at least become plan B, or it should, like, now that things are sort of going back to normal, we've realized that there's actually some real benefits to remote learning or digital learning. There's some big drawbacks. It's just like remote work, right? There's some real benefits
right.
to remote work,
Right.
real drawbacks to remote work. So I hope we see a lot of people saying, well, how can we retain some of the benefits of remote learning? And I hope that game-based learning rises, sort of percolates to the top as one of the things that can be um, that can move closer toward a plan A, where we're like, okay, now we're actually going to spend some time and energy on integrating this pedagogy more intentionally and more mindfully into our everyday practice, even now that things are going back to physicality.
Right. Right. And just to maybe I want to go back to talking about during the pandemic, but to kind of bring that point home, one thing that I did, and I was only able to do it for a year, and I wish I was maybe back in the classroom, or maybe I'll have an opportunity to do it again in the future, was flip my classroom. And that was really beneficial for me because one, I had two courses with 60 to 70 students and it was a writing class. So it was like almost I needed to figure out something to do this
Yeah,
right and
right.
give the individual attention to the students that they need to help them with their essays. So I was able to do that and that was really great because it did facilitate an experience where there was more a student-centered approach to learning. I was also there as a coach in a sense,
Yep.
where I could kind of walk them through their essays and meet with them one-on-one. And then they had opportunity where they get peer support in the classroom as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I really like that, and I hope that we kinda take some of those things from maybe the flipped classroom experience and some things we've learned from the pandemic and kinda apply it to the future. But you also made a
Totally.
really good point with the during the pandemic that it was disruptive, and for some teachers, they were just trying to keep up, right?
Yeah.
And for me, when I've done game-based learning or gamification, I've taken that summer to kind of prepare for,
Right.
like, something bigger, newer, like a I gamified an entire semester, and that
Mm.
took me like a month to kind of lay down the framework for it.
Yeah,
Um, and you can't do that during a pandemic. I mean, a lot of teachers are still figuring out over the summer how they're going to do virtual learning. So
that's right. Yeah.
I think maybe it was like you mentioned, maybe some of the teachers that already have an experience with game-based learning were able to integrate it a little bit more and lean into it during the pandemic.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. I'm fond of the phrase "never waste a good crisis." I don't know who said it, but um, in terms of attribution, but I yeah, I hope that I sincerely, the education system in general, I think, was overdue for a good shakeup, and and for everybody to just sort of be forced to not be able to do things the way they normally do and get outside their comfort zone, and to yeah, just try new things. And so I really hope that, in the same way that even outside of the education system, a lot of people were like, hey, I think I want to try biking out now, or I want to
Right.
try owning a pet, or whatever, baking bread, gardening, all the standard pandemic hobbies that emerged. And it'll be really interesting to me to see to what extent things regress afterwards. If it's just like, okay, now let's go back to business as usual, or if
Mm,
there is this, and I really do think it. I think it will not. I think that will not happen. I really do think that that things will not revert to business as usual, and that a lot of people will sort of carry this new perspective with them, and whether that's specifically game-based learning should be another tool in my tool belt as part of, um, that I even if I don't use it every day, it's, I think of it as being something that I use every year, every semester, alongside all these other resources that I use, or if it's just people thinking more critically about our digital learning infrastructure and
mm,
digital learning resources and what good digital learning looks like, as opposed to thinking of digital learning as a band-aid, which is how we kind of had to think of it during the pandemic.
right, right. Yeah. I'm super curious. I mean, I'm a little biased with the game-based learning gamification. Like I really am curious how that's going to turn out. But you make a good point with digital learning. What are we going to bring to the classroom? I mean, one-on-one with Chromebooks or iPads, that's been a big push this last year. Like you have like you have to provide that now. And I imagine that's going to be a thing moving forward, which is awesome. Like that's super cool.
It is, and that's actually something. I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's another, at least from my perspective, it's another one of those double-edged swords, right? It's like there's, I love the idea of giving kids the tools that we use as professionals outside of
Mm,
school to facilitate the types of tasks and more importantly thinking, that grown-ups do. At the same time, for reasons that make total sense, we are making really big investments in a very particular type of digital infrastructure, right? So like web-enabled computers like Chromebooks or
mm,
tablets, and in general, sort of low, and from a processing power perspective or a graphical processing power perspective, especially sort of devices that are lower on the lower end of the spectrum, which
right,
facilitate all sorts of awesome things. Google Docs and just access to the internet in and of itself is it's huge. Um, but what it leaves behind is, um, some higher fidelity. So I'm now speaking from the perspective of a game developer, and games.
mm,
So here's another spectrum we can talk about, and that is the spectrum of, uh, uh, system requirements, right?
yeah,
And if we really want to push the envelope in terms of production values and sort of creating virtual spaces that are really engaging and really draw the player in, and in some cases maybe the visuals are really important to the learning objectives, like say we're making a game about a historical topic or something like that, that we have this really hard ceiling with delivering games through internet-enabled devices like Chromebooks and tablets that don't have onboard, higher-end
right,
processing systems or graphical GPUs. And so that's not like that's a problem for the future, probably. I think in general, right now, it's the focus really does need to be on like let's push as hard toward one-to-one as possible, but something for consideration for down the road.
right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I had to go through is the access to technology too. Is I'm teaching a class, Among Us Games and Human Behavior,
Oh, cool.
and
Nice.
Among Us is not available on Google Chromebooks at the school. So I'm like,
Okay.
okay, well, I have to make sure everyone has access to another
Exactly.
device. Otherwise, we probably have to do a different game. Um,
Yeah. Download and install can be the kiss of death for
yeah, right.
the school
Yeah.
IT infrastructure.
Mhm. Yeah. Cool. So, before we move into our game, do you have anything else you kind of want to share, or maybe last words of advice to someone looking at games or game-based learning or video games for learning?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of returning to that spectrum the original spectrum that we talked about, from sort of more content-oriented games to more soft skill-oriented games. I think we've seen games of all different types gradually infiltrate the school system.
Mm,
It's been a lot slower than I personally would like, and it's been more weighted toward the Kahoot end of the spectrum than the other end of the spectrum. Also to my chagrin, but that's okay. We got to start someplace.
right.
Um, but what I'm really hoping is that the thing that makes games come to the forefront, digital games, and shine as a learning tool, will actually be less sort of the pandemic and remote learning or distance learning, and more this sort of realization that, oh wow, like in less than 15 years, you know, maybe half the workforce is going to be eliminated by machine learning and
Mm,
robotics and automation, right? And that we have to be pushing more 21st century skills curriculum. We have to be pushing more future facing skills, soft skills, etc. We have to be pushing, 21st century literacies like coding and robotics. And um, that's where I'm really hoping that games shine, because like using games to teach content is fine. It works. We do it all the time. But the further you get toward the left end of that spectrum, the more it's sort of like a nuclear powered fly swatter, if you will. And and where we ultimately want to be is like, we want to be making these really rich and interesting problem spaces that let students flex their creative muscles and
right.
flex their problem solving muscles and all that kind of stuff. And those also coincidentally are the exact skills that they're going to need in order to not be replaced by machines when they
Right.
graduate, right?
Right.
And so I'm really hoping that those two trends converge, and that becomes that ends up being the thing that really makes the system at large wake up to the idea
Mm,
that learning games, deep, meaningful, impactful learning games, have an important place in the educator's tool belt.
right. And I mean, in my bubble, I feel like people are pushing for that for sure.
Mhm.
But it's like, okay, we're all pushing for it, but why is it not happening? Why is it not
Right.
changing? I
Well, it's
mean,
hard to
I
assess. That's one of the reasons for sure.
yeah, and also, yeah, I guess that I mean, how are how is a successful student assessed, right?
Right.
And I mean, another thing I'm hearing a lot, even more so during the pandemic, is social emotional learning, and
Yeah.
how
Right.
I think games are great for building those nurturing environments in your classroom with your students, and even just having opportunity to do that is super important and super valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. So we're gonna move into our game. I mentioned we're gonna play 5 second rule. This I'm still kind of figuring out how to do this. Usually I do it by audio, so it's just gonna take a second
Gotcha.
to get it up. All right. So if you haven't played 5 second rule for anyone watching, you have 3 or 5 seconds. 5 seconds to name three things in a category. So
Okay.
yeah.
And I just start rattling stuff off as quickly
Right.
as possible. Okay.
And here we go.
Animals. Okay. Cheetah, zebra, lion, giraffe, elephant. Oh my
Oh,
gosh, all African.
I think
Just so
you got it. You got it. You only have to name three, but
okay.
if you want to keep going, that's fine too.
There's no extra credit.
We'll go when it shows the five.
Okay, okay, rocks, birds, and grass.
Oh, nice. You even had a second to spare. So you're 2 for 2.
All right.
The next one.
Phone, computer, and tablet.
Oh, nice. Talking about
Phone, if we want to think tablets and phones with that. TV.
nice. 3 for 3. And we'll go to the next one in 2 seconds.
Sex. Okay. Cicadas, flies, and mantises. I was like, oh, what's the cool thing?
You got mantises.
Oh, the entomologist in me totally failed there. Okay.
All right, and I think this might be the last one. No,
Superheroes. Okay. Superman, Batman, and Robin.
nice. I think everyone goes Superman, Batman. That's always the two.
You know, it's fun. It I was thrown for a second because I just finished watching the series The Boys, which is about
Oh,
bad superheroes, and I was gonna
yeah,
list all them up, but uh, they're bad guys. They're not
yeah, yeah. That's a good
superheroes.
show, though. It's an interesting take on superheroes, I think.
It is.
All right, and the last one, we'll go 3, 2, 1.
Board games. Okay, Civilization, Risk, and Monopoly.
Ooh, just barely got that in. So I think you're 5 for 6, which is pretty good. That's pretty
All
good.
right. Oh, the praying mantis. I didn't. Dang it.
Awesome, Dan. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights. I learned a lot and I really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's good to reflect on some of the things about the pandemic and kind of moving forward. If anyone wants to learn more about Filament Games or maybe learn more about you, where might they do that?
Yeah, so our website is filamentgames.com, and we're on Facebook and Twitter and all the usual suspects. And I can also be reached directly at white@filamentgames.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, so thank you again for checking out the Board Game with Education videocast. Again, if you're listening to us on a podcast, come on over to YouTube. And for whether you're on YouTube or the podcast, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. That's where you will get a lot of different tips, resources, and all updates with Board Game with Education. You can go to boardgamewitheducation.com, or we will leave a link to the newsletter in the video description or the show notes below. All right, we'll see you next week.